Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the second episode of Schola Fides. And so we're going to be starting to talk theology today. I want to do that, though, by way of the historic Christian creeds. So, for example, what we're going to be doing is talking about the Apostles' Creed. But before we can do that, we need to face, or we might say confront, some really common objections to Christian creeds and confessions. And so maybe you are a member of an evangelical church, or maybe your background is in the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, or maybe the, more broadly speaking, just the Independent Fundamental Bible Church movement, and you're suspicious of creeds. And so maybe the pastor at your church has even at some point held up his Bible and said, this is our only creed and our only confession. So we need to deal with some of the objections to creeds and to confessions. And I really think that they tend to be a knee-jerk reaction that sees any emphasis on creeds or on confessions of faith as somehow supplanting the place of Scripture, or placing tradition on an equal or maybe even superior level to Scripture, and thus compromising a truly Protestant or evangelical view of Scripture's authority. And so a lot of the objections to creeds and to confessions, they're very often couched in language that really does seem to be very zealous for Scripture and for the authority of the Bible. But there are also other very powerful cultural forces that are at play within our own cultural context that are militating against adherence to historical expressions of the Christian faith. And so I'm really starting with three assumptions here. The first is that the past is important and that it has positive things to teach us. The second is that language is an appropriate vehicle for the stable transmission of the truth across both time and geography. And the third one is that there must be some institution that can authoritatively compose and enforce creeds and confessions of faith. And so really all three of those assumptions, if we're going to be really honest, face very serious opposition because they are completely opposed to the general flow or trajectory of modern Western culture, especially modern American culture. In our day and age, the past is seen more as a source of embarrassment than it is as a source of knowledge. And where the past is seen as useful at all, it's really only seen as a useful guide for what not to do. Language in our day is just as suspect. We live in a world that is buried in spin doctors, in dishonest politicians, in relentless marketing. One might also go so far as to say ruthless marketing. And in that sort of environment, language is seen and in fact often is manipulative, deceitful, downright wicked, rather than something that is transparent and can be taken at face value. And then institutions, whether they're multinational corporations, whether it's governments, they all seem to be out for nothing more than their own preservation. And it seems as though they're seeking control just for the sake of control, or that they're engaged in really the worst sort of bullying. And they are almost never seen as entities that exist for the real and practical benefit of others. And so I think then that the three assumptions that undergird creedalism and confessionalism really do fly in the face of our current cultural values. And so I do want to try and dive a little bit deeper into the cultural currents that at least in my opinion, are at work here. I think the first one is this devaluing of the past. I think that is fed by both science and technology. I think the massive strides that have been made in medicine and science generally and in technology contribute to a view of the modern world where everything is getting better and better, and yesterday's technology is out of date. Yesterday's science is out of date. And so we see this when people line up to get the latest version of the iPhone or the iPad or the Samsung Note, whatever they're on now. All of those feed a view of history and of the past as being passé, as being unnecessary. I mean, those people have nothing to teach us after all. I mean, we have all of the latest technology. And even where technology is concerned, there's an even deeper issue there. I mean, technology is really geared for the young. And so, we see grandchildren getting frustrated with their grandparents because they can't figure out how to use their iPhone, right? And, oh, come on, Grandma, I can't believe this. And so there is a elevation of youth that goes together with technology. And then on the language front, I think that there's almost a mysticism that's starting to come in there. And so we can come at that from multiple angles. When it comes to, like, for example, to language and politics, there is a political point of view that very much sees language and words as things that only exist to establish personal power and to maintain that personal power and privilege. And then in the church, you hear this this sort of statement. It's almost become a slogan that Christianity is a way of life. It's not a set of propositions. And that's true that Christianity is a way of life, but it's also a way of life that's founded upon history and is founded upon historical events. That there was a man, Jesus, who was present in Palestine in the first century, and that this man lived and did certain things and died. And so there are historical propositional claims that are part and parcel of Christianity. And then there is this other area of what I would call emotionalism, or maybe emotivism, I think is the language that Alistair McIntyre uses for it in his book After Virtue. And it really sees emotivism or emotionalism as the primary locus of truth. And so this is really the idea that certain emotions or emotional responses constitute truth. And this is an idea that can be heard with just shocking regularity in casual conversation, and especially on daytime talk shows. How often have you heard someone be interviewed and say, "Oh, well, I just know in my heart that it's true"? And so we see this, especially, I think, in ethical arguments, especially, that are often expressed as, well, if it feels good, how can it possibly be wrong? And that sort of argument has a certain amount of cultural respectability when it comes to, teenagers sleeping together. But thank God it hasn't yet become a justification for serial killing. And the evidence, in my mind, that this has penetrated the church is seen, again, in something that we talked about in the last video, in the fact that preaching has been so devalued. Preaching really returned to a prominent place in the life of Christ's church as a result of the Reformation, where preaching replaced the Mass as the central act of corporate Christian worship. And this shift in the church's practice really came about because of a renewed understanding of the gospel as promise and of salvation as being by faith in that promise. And so for that reason, the proclamation of that promise moved to the center of the stage. But in our own day, it's interesting that a lot of churches have shifted preaching back to the margins, and they've replaced it with drama with small groups, with democratic discourse, and with smells and bells, candles, incense, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, in the life of the church, all of that really does descend into the rankest sort of mysticism, where Christian theology and where doctrine are no longer true statements about the nature of God, but rather they are descriptions of religious feelings and religious sentiments. And so, for example, you can see that very prominently in the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher in the 19th century. And there is also this anti-authoritarian piece that goes together with that. And so if institutions are out for nothing more than their own preservation and they're seeking control only for control, then that means that the church as an institution is suspect in a very profound way, and that pastors are just out there after your money. And so all of those things feed together, in my opinion, to make historic creeds particularly suspect, especially at this point in time. But the reality is that there have been creeds and confessions from the earliest days of the Christian faith. And so we can see that, for example, when Paul uses this phrase about the form of sound words in Hebrews, and we can see that in the repetition of the phrase from Paul in the pastoral epistles, where he talks about this is a trustworthy saying. And so we do see these sort of early creedal statements that begin to develop very early in the history of the church, all the way back into the New Testament period. And so a creed is really meant to be nothing more than a faithful summary of what Scripture teaches. And so when we talk about creeds or when we talk about confessions, we're not trying to create something that's going to replace Scripture or something that's going to push Scripture out to the edges, but we are trying to create something that's going to give us a good and faithful summary of the totality of Scripture. And so we can see that, I think, in what is probably the earliest creed, the Apostles' Creed, also in some places known as the 12 Articles of the Christian Faith. And so because Christian theology is such a huge, massive area to try and dive into and to begin to study, we have to find a path into it. And so I think that creeds are probably the best way to do that, because they are what they claim to be. They are a summary of Christian teaching, and the really historic creeds, for example, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, any of the historic Reformation era confessions of faith, they've been around for thousands for the ancient creeds and or hundreds for the modern confessions of years. And so we need to be willing to listen to voices from the past that have something to tell us about the Christian faith. And so rather than trying to begin with a whole Bible overview or anything like that, I want to start with a very basic introduction to the Christian faith. And so if you're watching this and you're a mature Christian, you're going to think, well, I don't know that there's going to be anything in these videos for me. I hope that there will be, because we're going to be talking about some heavy theology when we do get into the Apostles' Creed. And so I want to invite you to stick around for that. But ultimately, I am asking you to think deeply with me about the place of creeds in the life of the church. And I want to encourage you as well to come back and join us next time. Thank you so much.